Hello, this is Vicki Davis with the Cool Cat Teacher Talk Show, where we talk to classroom teachers and educators around the world about what matters now in the classroom. Today, we're talking about how to engage students in learning.
Ever wondered how remarkable teaching happens? Find out right now at Cool Cat Teacher Talk with award-winning teacher Vicki Davis. Get insights from top educators, tech tips, and inspiration to elevate your teaching.
First, let's talk to Dr. Jenny Nash, Head of Education Impact for LEGO Education, a researcher who worked with the State of Engagement report that shares research behind student engagement from episode 863 of the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. What excites students to learn? Dr. Jenny, I know that you really advocate playful, hands-on learning. Does that resonate, or do people say, oh, play, that can't be good?
I think that play makes people pause sometimes, and they wonder, does that fit in schools? Does that fit in education? But when you break it down and we start talking about what it really is, everybody says, obviously, of course, that belongs in education. And of course, students are going to learn so much more when we bring it in and give them the opportunity to experience learning, to get hands-on, and really make meaning out of their learning for what they're doing with it.
Now, you have some new data on engagement from LEGO Education where you surveyed over 6,000 administrators, teachers, parents, and students. So what does that data tell us about this whole hands-on, play-based, project-based learning approach?
The data is really interesting because it highlights the fact that students are not engaged in school. 35% of administrators are saying, hey, kids are just not engaged with learning. And we see that's leading to some other issues. Behavior, obviously, absenteeism, students not really retaining information. And I think we know that those are some big hurdles that we're facing in education today. So getting that data really helps us confirm the fact that, guess what? We need to do something about this engagement. We need to take it really seriously. And it really starts to speak to some of the other things that we see, which is how students, when they're more engaged in learning in school, the outcomes are going to be better. Now, hopefully that's not rocket science to anybody, but really seeing the numbers behind that the attendance rate, 83% of that attendance rate is tied with that hands-on engaging learning piece and getting those students engaged in learning. And that can really start to improve those test scores as well. So you had 84% of people talking about how that can also improve scores. Maybe we're not talking deeply enough about with the engagement factor being a major player in what's happening.
You want students to want to come to school. I know for me this year, I taught a AP Computer Science Principles, and I'm real big on hands-on, game-based learning. I used a game-based learning approach for teaching coding. And all of my students, I'm so excited to say, got credit for that by passing their AP test. And my first year teaching it, said, Dr. Jenny, I was really, really nervous. That's awesome. I knew that if I applied the principles that I've applied in all my other classes, this hands-on, game-based learning, play, it's all part. I mean, those are older kids, right? So it applies to all classrooms, doesn't it?
But that was another part that came out of this data that was so interesting. 9 out of 10 teachers saying that it's never too late to engage students. So it doesn't really matter the age group that we have. It's really never too late to bring engagement in. They're never too old to bring play in. I think to your point, it just looks a little bit different with the older students. Now we're going to give them more project-based learning. We're giving them really big real-world problems to solve. And that might be a little bit different than what we're doing with some of our younger students, but they still need it just as much.
Fun is not a dirty word.
Fun is not a dirty.
It's great to have fun in school. I mean, don't we want to have fun at work? Don't we want to have fun at home? Not that it's like, we have to be careful with that word fun, because I can't always promise entertainment, Hollywood style experience. But there's something meaningful about learning that is fun when you have accomplished something.
But I think meaningful, right? Such an important word in what you just said. And we really talk at LEGO Education about play being purposeful play. You can't just come into the classroom and say, I'm going to make everything fun. You've got to be really intentional about the things we need to teach, the outcomes we want to see for our students. What is the knowledge they need to have? What are the skills that they need to have for the future? What is the future we're trying to develop them and get them ready for? With that, how can we be really purposeful about how we bring out those tenets of play? Curiosity. letting them fail and find, meaning in it, letting them struggle a little bit with ideas. And I think all of those tenets of play can come in and bring it and make it joyful and fun to learn without it just being about, I have to bring something in that's fun. That's not really the only criteria.
Yeah, and you can have kids highly engaged in something that's totally unrelated to your standards too. I like that you used the word purposeful.
Right.
We do have to have a purpose, and great teachers are artists, and they can weave play and purpose together in beautiful ways.
Absolutely. And what a beautiful description, because I think it is weaving that together. We talk about engagement, and it's thinking about, if I walk into a classroom and I see students are active, they must be engaged. But are they engaged in the actual learning? If we hear students talking, they must be collaborating. What a great collaborative system that's happening. But are they talking about the learning? And I think within that engagement, there is that fact that we need to be thoughtful about making sure it's purposeful. It's getting to those end results we see. And we can bring students' interest in as a result, right? That's engaging. We bring our interest in. Students taking some ownership, that's engaging. That pulls them in. Being able to make sure that they are active in their learning, but it's putting all of those things together and really being thoughtful about kind of what is the end result I want to see, and how do I architect and weave that together to make it so that students are going to get to that purpose, that outcome, but in that way that's going to allow them to be playful, to be collaborative, to maybe iterate on their learning. And just being really thoughtful about how we pull all of that back together, that I think is what makes it purposeful and intentional. And to your point, teachers out there are incredible in the way they come up with how to do that, not only for one subject area, but often with many getting stitched together and pulling in all of those skills that students need. And I'll round it out with one more stat that we found, and it's just that only 2 in 5 students were saying that they regularly are getting that play-based learning. This report is going to show that they want the play-based learning. It shows that teachers really believe in it and see the value in it. So I think the pep talk is, take that to heart and don't be afraid to find those small ways to bring it in. It can be that you see where somebody's struggling, you bring it in. It can be a challenge to your students. It can be something as small as, what are you curious about? Let's investigate it together. There's so many ways to bring it in. There's no wrong way to bring it in. It can only have an impact on your students.
So first, if we want to improve student engagement, we have to value it. In your school or home, are students excited to learn? Are they excited to come to class and ready to engage with the content? If not, let's take steps to improve student engagement. Now, before you just say, oh, play won't get them ready for the real world, I'd like to share what the research shows about the importance of play in raising children to be successful in uncertain times. We're going to talk to David Gann, author of The Playful Entrepreneur, How to Adapt and Thrive in Uncertain Times, and share his research about play from episode 449 in February of 2019. Interestingly, as I was preparing for the show, since I recorded this interview with him, David is now the chair of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. So I think that we can all agree, if he says play is important, he means it. So how do we learn through play?
Well, that's a great question. Everyone who is involved in education or is a parent will know that children often learn very quickly when they're playing. So the first thing is that we've all done it. We've all been children. We've all learned the hard way through playing and learning what hurts and what doesn't. I think, unfortunately, in most parts of the world, our education system then starts to structure life in a way that play takes place in the playground and other stuff takes place in the classroom. And so our book is really about how we can mix the two back together again, because the natural disposition in one form of learning is to learn by playing.
Sure. So how do we put it back together? What does that look like?
Well, most of my work is on innovation and how companies large and small develop new ideas, test them, and take them to market. And I've worked for many years on areas like new product development. And a large part of that process is about experimentation and then honing an idea so that it will work. We talk about things like proof of concept. We do product development tests and so on. What we've observed is that the most successful organizations have quite a playful disposition towards the way in which they explore how a new product or service will work. And we've tried to capture the essence of that.
So, David, why did you write the book?
I spent a long time, 35 years, studying innovation and helping businesses innovate. Part of that process has been observing how they experiment and explore, and that's a playful process. One of the motivations for our book was that there's a lot of uncertainty in business and in life in general these days, and we were interested in what sort of people were able to thrive in uncertain times, and we worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, and we found that they had a very good way of dealing with uncertainty, and part of that was the way in which they played with options in the future. And that's why we called it the playful entrepreneur. And AI and these sort of crosswinds that are coming across the workplace are part of that uncertainty. So the book uncovers how entrepreneurs have learned through testing themselves and exploring and experimenting with options in uncertain circumstances. And I think from a teaching point of view, it's very important because we need to encourage that exploratory nature in children and in young adults and help them navigate their own futures in uncertain environments.
So, David, what are those ingredients?
The types of people that we've observed who exhibit this sort of playfulness in the workplace have certain behaviors. And one of them, of course, is an ambition. And these days we find their ambition is to, of course, be successful. Entrepreneurs very often want to make money. But particularly amongst the younger generation that we've spoken with, we find that they also want to do more than that. They want to have social purpose. Certainly in the UK and across Europe and in other parts of the world, we see younger generations now setting up social enterprises. That ambition is part of the driver that gives them the motivation to explore and experiment and to learn through playing.
Yeah, so there's research on this millennial generation and even younger. And, you know, I talk about in the classroom that we don't want to have wastebasket work because this generation wants to have meaning. I think it's in the DNA of this generation to want to make a difference. And you think that's part of a playful attitude?
Well, I think it is, because you've got to have some motivation there, and then you've got to be searching. You've got to have that motivation to want to learn. You know, that natural process of play is part of your own makeup in each individual case as to how people learn. Vicky, you know what? The other side of this is that, you know, everyone's going to come up against speed bumps. They're going to come up against difficulties and uncertainties. And another attribute is you need the fortitude and resilience to move beyond those things. And, you know, when you hit a roadblock, you need to be able to navigate. And how do you do that? Well, you learn about what's confronting you. You have to play with the options that you have at hand and then navigate around it, find new ways. That's the essence of being an innovator, actually. And all of those little feedback loops that happen are part of the learning process and part of how in your mind's eye, you're playing with options and solutions. So two things go hand in hand: having ambition to do something great and having the fortitude to get through the things that come across your path that try and stop you doing it.
So, David, as we finish up, apply all of this to the K-12 classroom.
One thing's absolutely certain, that our children and young adults of today are phenomenally smart at adopting and being on the front foot with new technology. And so as teachers, if we're not with them on that, they're going to be one step ahead anyway. We have to create environments where they deploy technology in the right sort of learning networks And we need to allow them to experiment safely, and we need to allow them to play with it. And I think teachers have to be more playful to allow that to happen. And take that back to learning. That means that we, through our adult life as teachers and educators, need to continue to play with the tools that we use, the AI, the digital tools, the spaces that we use in classrooms, in order to provide the best service and the best quality education.
So you can see we need playful learning because it prepares students for a real world of uncertainty and innovation. Another interesting statistic from the LEGO Education Report is that 80% of U.S. teachers said their jobs would be more rewarding if their students were engaged in learning, and also that they would be happier at their job. Student engagement also has been shown to improve teacher retention. For the rest of the show, we're going to focus on the strategies of improving student engagement. Next, we're going to talk to Eric Scheninger, and he has many credentials, but I first met him when he was the award-winning principal of New Milford High School in New Jersey, and his teachers loved him. I actually went to his school, and his kids loved learning. So let's talk with Eric Scheninger from episode 854 of the 10-Minute Teacher, how to really engage students in the classroom. Today we have my friend Eric Scheninger. He's been a principal, he's a thought leader, he's a change leader, works with schools all around the world, CEO of Aspire Change EDU, author of many books, including Disruptive Thinking in Our Classrooms. And Eric, today we're going to talk about true student engagement. As you were traveling the world, what are you seeing in 2024 in terms of student engagement?
It's one of those things that is not new. And I challenge anyone that, a lot of the things that we're trying to implement are not new, but are we doing them consistently and with continuity? When we think about engagement, the key is, are students engaged in learning? I always like to think about, well, who's doing the work? Is the teacher doing all the work? Or are they powering those learners through agency to apply their thinking in relevant and meaningful ways? And what I see as I spend a lot of time with one of my many hats, but my favorite hat is my coaching hat. When I'm working in classrooms with leaders, a lot of our conversations are revolving around, how do we move from compliance to engagement in learning? And how do we define compliance? Students are taking notes, they're watching a video, they're doing a low-level worksheet. They are just sitting there passively consuming. We want to move away from that. I'm not saying get rid of direct instruction, whole group. That's still a high effect strategy when you look at meta-analysis from John Hattie. But how do we really get those students not only thinking at higher levels, but applying their thinking in interdisciplinary ways to solve real-world problems, and real-world problems that are unpredictable.
So you have on your blog, and you've written about the relevant thinking framework. Is being relevant to their everyday lives part of increasing engagement?
I think it's making the attempts. And here's what I say to every single teacher and administrator. You will not engage every single learner. It is impossible. I know I work with adults, and working with adults is harder than working with kids. Will not engage everyone because I don't know what's going on outside the session. Same thing with the classroom is you can only control what goes on in your classroom. You cannot control what's happening in the hallways, other classrooms, or at home. So what I like to say is, how do we create the conditions to engage as many learners as possible? And it begins with having clarity in our practice. And that clarity, revolves around what I feel are simple in theory, but in practicality, again, it comes back to that consistency and continuity. How do we engage learners at various levels of, whether you call it DOK, Bloom's taxonomy, levels of cognition, doesn't matter to me. It's all the same thing. How do we challenge them to think? But looking at the relevant thinking framework, how do we make learning meaningful, purposeful, authentic? And I like to think it goes back to the work of Madeline Hunter, who coined the anticipatory set, or you might call it a hook. So those first couple minutes, how do we attempt to make that connection to something that students see that relevance. And coming back at the end, closure. Why did I learn this? How will I use it outside of school? And what tells me if I'm successful? I'm a realist. I think it's making attempts. It's hard. And we don't want to give teachers more to do. We already know that, hey, just another thing is not going to work. So I do think the attempts to make it relevant and meaningful, because that's what we want as adults. But if that relevance piece is missing, I'll plug it into AI and say, how can you make this relevant to fifth grade students based on that standard? AI is probably if not the most disruptive force impacting education right now, but it still comes down to our ability to facilitate engaged lessons, to provide teachers feedback. AI is not going to do that for us. So I think we have to tread lightly here and always come back to, what is the research telling us is an effective practice? How are we showing evidence that what we are doing is actually impacting, in this case, student engagement and learning, and then look to where AI can help to fill in those gaps.
Let's take a trip around the world. I want you to think about the places you've been and think about, like, I saw this and it was amazing.
I remember I'll be heading back to the Middle East in May, and I was there in October. They're really looking at replacing conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems. And these students came in and they showed me not only a business model, but their prototype for how they were going to solve this problem. And what I saw was purposeful use of technology, choice, higher order thinking, relevance in terms of going back to the relevant thinking framework, being able to solve real world unpredictable problems. Here in the United States, in Quest Academy Junior High, the best competency-based learning that I've ever seen.
Wow.
They've got rid of grades, got rid of points. They've unpacked every standard into rubrics. But the one thing that they really focused on was making learning relevant, bringing in student voice, choice aligned to standards, providing writing prompts. Innovative practice could be having a hook at the beginning of the lesson, implementing an exit ticket consistently, looking at the formative data from the exit ticket and determining if we're going to do a reteach. I do, we do, you do. What I'm seeing across the globe is the schools that are finding success are understanding they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but they do need to ask the right questions. And those questions are my students learning? Where's the level of thinking? How am I making learning relevant, meaningful? How am I meeting the diverse needs of my students? How is technology leveraged in a purposeful way? What do my learners think of the lesson? Questions are more important than answers, Vicki, and that's what I'm seeing across the world with schools, the educators, the leaders who are making growth a consistent journey.
One thing Eric said several times in his interview was the importance of engaging students the moment they walk into the classroom. This is called the hook. And no one does hooks better than the author of one of my favorite books on student engagement, Dave Burgess. He has authored Teach Like a Pirate. This is taken from episode 17 of the 10-Minute Teacher podcast.
So, Dave, what motivated you to try something different in your classroom to engage your students?
You know, I wanted to be a reprieve from the monotony of the traditional educational system, not a contributing factor. And I think there's kids in our school systems that are bored and feel school is irrelevant for them. And I felt that way sometimes as a student myself. And I vowed when I went into teaching that I was never going to have a class where kids felt that way. And so that was one of the things that motivated me to try some new and innovative ideas.
Okay, Dave, so what is the craziest thing you ever did to engage your students in a lesson?
That's a tough question, Biggie. I've done some pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, you have.
So I think some of the craziest things I've done are I've completely transformed my entire room into various scenes, into lunar landings, into 60s parties, into speakeasies. I've taken kids out on full period safari walks where we discover. I have hidden stuff all around the entire school, around the outskirts of the school, and we go on a history walk of discovery. I've buried skeletons out there. I've created Native American territories. And so it's just always trying to go that extra little step to do something that throws them off their guard.
Okay, so, it's intimidating. And I will say that you have pushed me out of my comfort zone. I've dressed like a zombie. I've done all kinds of different stuff. But it is kind of uncomfortable when you say, okay, I'm going to have a hook and I'm going to engage my students and I'm going to have a theme. How do you help teachers feel a little bit more comfortable with the idea of being part of the experience of learning?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I tell teachers is that all progress is found outside of your comfort zone. So if you're never uncomfortable as an educator, then you're not growing. You're not getting as good as you possibly can. So it's okay to feel uncomfortable. And it's okay when it doesn't go right and when you fall on your face. And that's part of life. And that's when we get a chance, that wonderful chance to model for students that growth mindset, that idea that it's okay to fail. And you know what? I'm going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to try something new again. And so when we always think that our lessons have to go perfect, I think we do a disservice not only to ourselves because we don't push the edge, but we do a disservice to our students too, because it's incredible for them to get to see us in that role model position fail and see how we react to that and see that we just see it as feedback. Everything that happens in a classroom is feedback. It's not failure. Don't personalize it. Don't beat yourself up about it. Don't beat kids up about it. Everything that happens in the classroom is feedback. They're providing us the real-time gift of feedback in order to help us improve and hone our craft.
I'll admit this. I've done dress up. I've done some crazy stuff. But if I know I'm being observed, I just back off a little bit. And a lot of us have pop-ins and walk-ins. And if I ever had a pop-in when I was doing something wild and crazy, I might feel a little uncomfortable.
So I have a strange answer for this one that sometimes makes teachers uncomfortable. And I think that the answer is that you should be observed more often. And that if you only have an administrator in your room in that rare instance when they just pop in and they're doing your evaluation, then you're at risk of having something taken out of context in just a small little snippet. So I think the answer is to invite them in more often. Get them into your room when you're doing amazing lessons, when you know you have stuff that's going to be a home run. Get them in there so they see you teaching under all kinds of different circumstances and being successful, and have educational conversations with your administrators as well and talk about the pedagogy that's behind some of these ideas. And when you open up that dialogue and when they get to see you more often, then when they do happen to come in and see something that's a little outside the norm for them and they might be uncomfortable with, they get to see it in the context of a much larger picture.
Well, you're speaking from experience, aren't you, Dave?
Absolutely. I've had some administrators come in at some very odd times.
And give us an example.
Well, so I have a famous example that I use in the workshop where I pull a burnt bra out of a bag. And I've had an administrator walk in with me holding a burnt bra, dangling Victoria's Secret bra in front of my class. Now, in context, it made perfect sense as we were talking about the bra burning, the feminist movement of the 1960s and all that. And it was a hook to draw them into us talking about these larger issues of women reacting against the conservative values of the 50s, right? But out of context, it was certainly a pretty awkward thing. And so that's why it's important to have administrators in your room more often to be able to justify and know some of the pedagogy behind the stuff that you're doing and stuff that you're trying with kids.
Yeah, it can be so challenging. Okay, so Dave, give teachers your 30-second pep talk about really trying to engage their kids.
It does not matter what you say if nobody's listening. It always comes back to engagement, to hooking those students in to what you're doing. And so it doesn't matter how much you teach, it's how much is actually received, how much they take part in, and how much they're engaged with. And so we are in literally the life-changing business. This is about a mightier purpose than what outside forces want to drag our teachers towards. And so this is about a very mighty purpose. We're in the life-changing business. And so that extra effort that you put into engaging those kids and creating wildly outrageous lessons that draw them almost magically or magnetically into what you're doing in the classroom is going to be completely worth it. It's going to be fulfilling both for you and for them as well. And you're making a huge difference in the world. So keep fighting the good fight.
And as we talk about learning, Dave said something so important I want to reiterate. Everything that happens in a classroom is feedback. It's not failure, it's feedback. And you know what? It can be scary to change as an educator, but there are ways to do it. I call it innovating like a turtle. Make slow, steady progress. Share what you learned with other teachers and try one new thing from today's show. So here's another principle to engage every student: movement and brain breaks. So this particular episode from occupational therapist Suzanne Cresswell is one of the most popular shows I've aired on the 10-Minute Teacher podcast, and it helps us understand better how to reach every child. This is episode 244, Why Kids Can't Stop Moving, the neuroscience behind a student's need to move.
Today we're talking with Suzanne Cresswell. She's an occupational therapist and physical therapist. Now, Suzanne, what is a unique learner?
A unique learner is a little bit of all of us, really. Children and adults have their own way of making sense of the world around them. When we think of learning, we think of the sensory system taking in information visually, auditorily, tactilely, and each one of us has our own unique way of interpreting that information. But in general, there's kind of patterns of how the brain collects this information. And in our education model, we augment that, our understanding of the developmental model in teaching incrementally, as the child can develop these skills. But a unique learner tends to be on a little different path. They tend to learn at a different pace. And the emphasis in my book, Unique Learner Solutions, is that these students learn differently, not incorrectly necessarily, but it's a difficult thing sometimes to capture in our general education classroom where we're focused on the curriculum and the standards of meeting certain timeframes, that certain ideas are needing to be presented to the classroom. So the unique learner can be that child that causes the teacher to sort of take a deep breath sometimes when they think about planning their morning or planning their day, because this is an individual who doesn't always follow the flow, the rhythm, the timing of the learning that goes on in general in the classroom.
What I call learning differences. I don't call them disabilities because my children can learn. They just learn differently. So would you say that someone who has a learning difference is a unique learner or not always?
Oh, no, we're talking about the same person. Yes.
So these children are learning differently. We realize that. Sometimes they'll show it by acting out. Sometimes they'll show it because you look at them and they're trying really, really hard. They're not understanding it. What do we do? Where do we start?
I'll start with the comment when they're acting out. That right there requires a little more inquiry as to what might be motivating the child to act in a way that we would characterize as acting out. Are they physically moving frequently in their chair? Are they interrupting and are off topic? Are they head on the desk, not interacting, type of acting out? And to go beyond that, to take it to the next step and start to look at what might be contributing to that particular, I'm going to call that a strategy on the student's part. What I've learned in working with this population for 30 years in a medical setting and in a school setting and in sports setting with young athletes, some young people tend to develop strategies even on a subconscious level in order to assist their brain to stay engaged. We're hardwired to learn. We must take in information. We must integrate that with past events, our memory, and process that in terms of our intellectual understanding in order to take the next step. This is something that is as necessary as breathing in and breathing out. So to make that essential process work for some of these children that have a different way of perceiving information, they come up with strategies. Some children require a heck of a lot of movement to keep their body going. And I'd like to explain a little bit about that if I might, but it goes into big fat neurophysiologic words, but I think it helps to understand. What do you think? Should we go there?
Yeah. So, I know, for example, I have a lot of kids who have, ADD or have other things, and we'll do planks in the classroom. We'll stop and I'll say, okay, we're going to do push-ups, or you're going to do planks, or I'm going to go for a minute just to get some of that energy out. Is that what you're talking about?
I want to tell you why you're doing planks and why that's working. But first of all, let me put my hands together and applaud you. That's fantastic. So let's talk about that busy child, the busy one, the hyperactive child, of ADHD, if you like. Those are often the students that we'll see in a general education setting. They've got good understanding of many of the academic concepts when they are in a situation that they can demonstrate that to the teacher. And yet they are at a little different rhythm than the other students. They're moving more, or they're at the end of the answer, when you're still really looking to see how the child solves it in the process, these types of things that are sometimes that's difficult to integrate. So it ends up being the language that the child is having an upset or an outbreak or what have you. So I totally understand the use of that language. But the interesting thing is to look a little bit beyond that. You see, in order to learn, it's a very developmentally wired process, starting in infancy and moving on. And let me just quickly take you back. Okay, infancy. First of all, we're moving out of a buoyant environment inside our mommy's womb. And the first experience we have, the first neurologic thing that our brain understands is the gravitational pull of the Earth's surface, having moved from the buoyancy. That's the very first thing that happens. And the brain connects with that feeling and then must tell the muscles and joints what to do in order to respond to gravity. So rather than going, if you don't mind my saying, kind of plop, splat, they need to figure out that's gravity. And I need to tell my head and neck and arms basically to do a little bit of a plank if I'm on my tummy so I can lift my head and continue breathing, and then ultimately move to a source of food and that tactile nurturing. Well, that right there, that feeling gravity and then telling your muscles and joints what to do is as part of our sensory system. We have senses, taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing, but these two senses, feeling gravity, it's a word called the vestibular system, and feeling your muscles and joints respond to your commands, if you will, is the proprioceptive system. We continue to feed the vestibular and proprioceptive system. We continue to feed our sense of feeling gravity operate on our body, feeling our muscles and joints respond optimally to gravity all of our life. But we move it to a part of a brain that we don't really interact with that much. That's why we like walking. That's like why we like exercise. That's why we like yoga as adults. These are things that we do, we bring into our life. It's in our mind, in our body, in our muscles, and so forth. That's why you're doing planks for these kids, because you're stimulating their proprioceptive center. You're stimulating their vestibular center. And the children that require movement, that are moving in the class at a different rhythm, different rate, and moving at all when the other children are sitting still, this is a child that needs to interact with the vestibular center and the proprioceptive center in order to keep the brain charged for learning. And understanding that, then we can create a safe way for that child to be able to function in a social classroom environment. If they need movement, then we provide them with perhaps a seat pan cushion that's slightly inflated so that they can move and yet they're physically within their seat so they're not interrupting others. Some classrooms will obtain the yoga ball, the therapy ball, and find a collar for it so it doesn't roll anywhere, and the student then will sit on the ball. And of course, if you're sitting on a round chair, a round surface, your brain is continually interacting with the gravitational pull of the Earth's surface and your body's ability to respond to those movements. And that continually feeds the brain and keeps the brain active in order for learning.
And, this is so related to even flexible seating, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's it's very much the same concept. So we will provide, once we begin to understand that it's a strategy, if we look beyond the erratic behavior, if you will, and look at what that might be caused by, then we can provide solutions for the student. And then the student is able, in their unique way, to keep their brain and body geared up and continuing to participate in the classroom lessons and the learning that occurs. But my tendency is to walk into a classroom to see the student I've been invited to provide some assistance with, and to look at the child basically is already perfect, if you will, and that they are doing the best they can in order to function within their circumstances. And how successful is that? And sometimes the way they're acting is exactly what you want in the gymnasium, but not in the library. And they can't tell that distinction. And so they need to be taught, the place for things and how to be able to identify that. But while you're doing planks, that's putting pressure through the joints of the arms and hands, and that pressure is what informs the brain, the proprioceptive center, and overall that kind of floods the brain with a calming feeling. when you think planks, when you think movement breaks, even if you think of recess and lunch breaks, that's all the yoga in the middle of the day, if that has meaning for you, yoga, or that's the taking the walk in the middle of your work day. That's what we all need, but children even more need movement infused frequently during their day. Useful movement. The planks are wonderful. Other movement patterns that help learning readiness are that right brain, left brain types of movement as well, where you're crossing your arms across midline. And
those types of movement breaks are useful in the classroom all the time.
Well, we've learned so much today, and the truth is that there is a reason so many kids can't stop moving. There's nothing wrong with them. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be just told to have more control. I think as a teacher that giving brain breaks, giving movement breaks, giving flexible seating, this is all part of being a good teacher. Now, I want to quote my mom here because she was one of the greatest teachers that I've ever known. Mom always said, remember, Vicki, when you accommodate for a child who learns differently, you're actually helping everyone in your classroom because everyone learns differently. And my sister Susan has always reminded me that up to 1/3 of gifted kids actually learn differently. So just because children don't have an IEP or a diagnosis does not mean they won't benefit from movement and flexible seating. They absolutely will benefit. Movement is important for every age and every stage, and you and I need it too, teachers. Now, I could hear some educators saying, but Vicki, you don't understand. We have kids who are behind here. Our classrooms need to be tougher, stricter places, and not these fun, engaging classrooms you're talking about. Well, maybe none of the educators are saying that, but I've heard it said before. We do need to help our students get caught up, and we need to bridge the gaps. But let's admit it, what is more boring than hearing something yet again that you have learned for the last several years, but the teacher is reteaching it because some kids are behind? We need to learn how to handle that aspect of student engagement with something called acceleration research. Nancy Fry, co-author of the book Rebound, a playbook for rebuilding agency, accelerating learning recovery, and rethinking schools, from episode 770 of the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. In Volume 2 of the Ed COVID-19 Handbook from the U.S. Department of Education, they shared a few essential statistics. The pandemic has definitely negatively impacted math and widened achievement gaps, and there is little doubt that many of our amazing kids are being left behind. So while some advocate acceleration just for gifted kids, we actually need acceleration for all of our students. It isn't about catching up. Right now, education is about reaching potential. We would love to see this generation transcend and rise above. Nancy, we want to talk about accelerated learning. What is it, and what does the research say?
Well, thank you so much, Vicki, for having me on. And yes, you're exactly right. The focus this year, especially now more than ever, is on really addressing and implementing things that we know that are related to acceleration of learning in particular. We don't want to retreat to a remediation. We know that there's unfinished learning that's there. We know that there's unrealized potential. But it's really important that we think about, in particular, what the acceleration research says and how it is that we can turn that into our own practices. And the good news is that the acceleration research is really robust.
What does it tell us? So many schools are overwhelmed with just how much they need to accelerate. How do we hit the gas pedal without stressing everybody out?
Exactly. I totally understand that. And, one of the interesting points in that acceleration research, which really is drawn from the Visible Learning Database that we often reference, the first is to really focus in on what it is that kids need to know, not just what's neat to know. So in other words, here would be a big mistake, Vicki. A big mistake would be for a third grade teacher to say, oh, well, these students that are coming in, surely they have not mastered second grade content, So I guess I need to spend the first quarter reteaching second grade. No, no, no. Take a look at what your third grade unit of instruction is that's coming up and identify what are those skills and concepts that students are going to need right now in order to access that. Assess based on that, where are my students at? Reteach the items that they need and move forward. We want to make sure that students are accessing that standards-based learning that is so important. We're not going to be able to move forward if we're just kicking the can down the road and teaching last year's content. Does that make sense?
It does. But, I've had teachers say, what do I do if I can't start on page 1? Because they didn't get all the way through the book last year.
So let me share an easy example, Cole, that I utilize and that Doug utilizes. Let's say I'm a science teacher. My unit of instruction that's coming up is around volcanoes. I have a 2-week unit that's coming up. That's a part of my 7th grade science content. Now, the first thing that I need to do is to do a little of that initial assessment work. A few days before I start that unit of instruction, I give all of the students an ABC chart, a vocabulary chart, and I invite them to write down A's and B's and so on, what kinds of terms you would expect to hear in a volcano unit. That actually gives me some really good feedback before I've ever even started my instruction about what it is that students already know. If I see a lot of students that are saying, I expect to hear about magma, I expect to hear about lava, then guess what? I don't need to teach all of that. I then engage in that unit of instruction about halfway through, redistribute those ABC charts and say to them again, go ahead and add on to there terms that you associate with learning about volcanoes. And now I look and I get some formative assessment for myself. Am I seeing that students are adding things like rim of fire because I know that I've taught that, and they're adding things like ash and so on. I finish teaching my unit. I redistribute that same ABC chart one more time, and I ask them to finish that up, add more terms that you believe are associated with that. And then guess what? That's your study sheet, because that's what it is that's going to be on the competency on the end of unit exam that we'll be doing next week.
What do you do when you have some students who are extremely prepared and ready for the unit, and you have other students who don't know anything? Do the students who already know all of that content have to sit there and listen to you reteach?
What a great question, Vicki. I appreciate that. And for those students who already know much of the content, you employ those students in order to be able to support those who have some gaps in their learning. As I noted earlier, identifying who are those students that are missing some things. Now I'm going to do some heterogeneous grouping with students, and I'm going to deploy those students that are quite knowledgeable already from time to time to serve as peer tutors. The evidence on peer tutors is this, that the true value of peer tutors is to the person who's doing the tutoring. Because when you get an opportunity to be able to reteach somebody else something, it solidifies what it is that you know. It's a win-win situation.
So that's a way to accelerate peer tutoring?
That's one of the ways, yes. And I think it's really important to say that when we're talking about acceleration, we're not talking about pinning all of our hopes on one approach and one approach only. I'll add a third one to that. The evidence on acceleration is that when students have learning goals, it speeds up the rate of their learning. Taking one success criteria for the day or for the lesson and turning that into a goal and into a self-assessment speeds up the rate of learning, and it allows students to be able to monitor their own progress. The evidence on goal setting versus not having learning goals is extensive, and another key to being able to accelerate learning.
Wow. So helping students set learning goals, is that something you do as part of the beginning of a unit? How do you go about doing that?
You might be doing it at the beginning of the unit. I often do it on a daily basis. So articulating, first of all, what's our success criteria for today? What does success look like? And then based on that, what do you already know about this topic? Or what do you think is going to be easy or hard about this topic? I might be doing something like that at the beginning of the lesson. As we come to the close of that lesson, I go back to that success criteria again, and I ask them to look at their self-assessment. Was your self-assessment that you did at the beginning of this lesson accurate? Are there things that you still don't know? Because that's going to give me, as an exit ticket, some great information about what it is I need to do tomorrow.
How about this whole social emotional learning aspect? You have a student who comes into class and you can tell that they are emotionally traumatized by the circumstances that they find themselves in or been in. How does that weigh into acceleration research?
I think that, again, it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. First of all, I think it's really important to be able to acknowledge that for students who are experiencing trauma, that we need as teachers to immediately turn to the experts that we have available. Are we, for example, making sure that a counselor or a social worker is connected with that student? But let's set that to the side for a moment and talk about classroom practice. For so many students, it's their confidence right now that is really undermining their ability to be able to progress. We've got kids who have a damaged relationship with learning, and they're not quite sure that they can actually learn the things that are happening in your classroom. Some ways to be able to build confidence include, as I noted earlier, setting some goals together, encouraging that kind of self-assessment. Take a look back on what it was that you thought was hard, what might be hard, and what might be easy to do. How did you do? Were your predictions correct or not? Making sure we give lots of opportunities for students to be able to empty their heads. So often, kids are walking around and they're trying to keep everything in their heads instead of putting it down on paper, right? So that's a great time where we step in with those learning strategies. Let's talk about what it is that you already know. Let's put that down on a graphic organizer or in your notes so that you're not carrying it in your heads. And then finally, make sure that you're celebrating their successes, not just successes at the end of the unit, but their daily successes as well.
So here are some of the principles we've learned on today's show. First, we value student engagement and seek to improve it. Second, we empower teachers to hook students into learning with exciting activities and themes. Third, we use everything in our classroom as feedback, and we innovate like a turtle to try new things to better engage our students. Fourth, we provide brain breaks or movement breaks in our classrooms. Fifth, consider flexible seating options. Sixth, assess student knowledge at the beginning of a unit to teach what students need to know and not repeat content they've already mastered. Seventh, we can use strategies like peer tutoring and learning goals and become familiar with the acceleration research. I want you to get inspired by Alabama State Teacher of the Year 2018-2019. She was also recognized for raising the AP scores of minority students, Zest Simmons, on episode 626 of the 10-Minute Teacher podcast.
So you've been teaching now almost for 21 years. If you could go back in time and talk to Zest Simmons on the first day of teaching, as a first-year teacher, what would you say to yourself to help you fall in love with teaching faster?
I think first thing I'd say is sit down. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Everything that I stressed about with students, making sure I wanted to make sure they had everything at once. I've learned with age and with time is that all students learn differently and at their own pace. And what I'm doing is not futile when I'm giving them information and it seems like they're not getting it. Because I love when my students come back 2 and 3, sometimes 10 years later, and they're using the very things. They're like, yeah, I remember you teaching me this, and I use this in my life. I use writing when it comes to filling out applications, or when I am writing my blog, or when I'm creating speeches. I use the very things that you thought I wasn't listening to, but I was listening. So those type things I would definitely tell the younger me when I would kind of get frustrated and I think that, oh, my students are not listening. Yeah, they're listening. They're listening. And I would definitely, you're planting seeds. They grow and bear fruit.
What does your internal self-talk sound like that gets you back to loving teaching, even amidst the struggles?
And I can tell you this, when it comes to struggles, I've had, and I'm going to go ahead and admit, moments where I thought maybe I shouldn't be here or I shouldn't be teaching. I think you cannot teach for 21 years, I don't think for 10 years, and come up against some of the things, especially in education, that really can't be helped because of the machine of public education or any educational system. And you find yourself discouraged and somewhat disillusioned. I think I hit the disillusion wall round about year 7 with what I expected and what it was. And then I found myself, it has always come back to the students. It has always come back to that one child, that one student that made me kind of recondition myself to know that is the reason. No matter what policy, no matter what initiative, no matter what punitive whatever that comes across the board, even no matter what trend, no matter what technology, no matter what comes across or what gets taken away, there are still children. Every child that shows up, they're coming to learn because their education may be their only way. And so I regroup, I come back, and it allows me, hitting that wall also allows me to come back creative and find new ways to adjust and reach that child. So my self-talk, to go back to the question, my self-talk, to be fearless and stay focused, that it's not about immediate, I feel should be, but allowing what is there to be, whatever it is, and then responding to it with all my ability, all my talent, all my skill, so that it benefit the kids that come in and the kids that need it.
Because, we can get out of education, but these kids can't. If they do, it's not going to end well.
They cannot. And it is the one thing that they have. Oh, it's amazing the hunger that a lot of students have because that we have a teacher shortage. And so students now using access for school as opposed to a human being that plans and understands their needs is very, very difficult for them sometimes to process being lonely in that learning process. And so that's why I show up, because I want to be there for them.
Teaching is tough, but teaching is worth it. Remember that our classrooms today are the present we give tomorrow. So fellow teachers, student engagement is something that we all aim and strive for. I work for it every day in my classroom. And none of us are perfect. I have those days where I go home and on the drive, I'm thinking, wow, that didn't work. But you know what? I'm reminded after today that I'm going to listen to that as feedback. So I want you to think about something that's happened in your classroom that you want to improve. But also, though, think about what worked and how you can do more of that. And sit down at the lunch table or at break this week and have a conversation with fellow teachers about what's really engaging their students. And if you're struggling or frustrated, remember Zest Simmons today and why you're doing this. The kids need us. They need us to be excited about teaching so they can be excited about learning.
Stay in the loop. Visit coolcatteacher.com for the latest tips and trends. See you later, educators.
The show notes for this episode will be at coolcatteacher.com/talk engagement.